Welcome to the Phillip Wylie Show. Take a look behind the curtain of professional hacking and hear compelling discussions with guests from diverse backgrounds who share a common curiosity and passion for challenges and their job. And now, here's your host, offensive security professional, educator, mentor, and author, Phillip Wylie.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Phillip Wylie Show. Today I'm joined by Jeff Caruso. Jeff was introduced to me by a mutual friend, and Jeff has a book out that we'll be getting into, but he's got a really cool background, really cool story. We discussed some things prior to the podcast, so this is going to be a really intriguing episode. So welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Phil. I appreciate that you invited me to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Some of the best episodes I get are people that are through introductions because most of my guests I know from the cybersecurity community, and I know a little bit of something about them, but, we really just now meeting virtually, I guess you could say. And so I don't know anything about you. And these are always the fun ones when I get to know more about my guests and hear some of the things that they have to share.
That's fun for me too. I always love meeting new people and having the time to have an actual in-depth conversation. It's rare these days.
Yes. And so before we get started, I always ask my guests to share their hacker origin stories. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your origin story, kind of how you got started and where you're up to now in your career.
So, of course, personally, I'm not a hacker. I admire hackers. I think what they do is awesome. One of my best friends has been a hacker since he was, 17 years old, and he's in his 40s now, causing all kinds of mayhem in Russia. My particular origin story is that I'm a veteran. I used to work as a radioman for the Coast Guard. While I was in the Coast Guard, I was solicited by the CIA because they needed radiomen and Coast Guard radiomen and had the same skill set because it's a small service, about the size of the New York Police Department back then. This was after Vietnam. And so I jumped through a bunch of hoops for that agency. And just before I was hired, President Carter initiated a hiring freeze. So I went on to patience was not a virtue of mine when I was younger. So I went on to waste about maybe 20 years traveling around and living as a single guy and just doing things that interested me and then moving on to something else. And it wasn't until I met my current wife that I decided to get serious and became a technical writer at Microsoft on their financial intelligence team. And this was in early days of the Iraq and Afghanistan. So while I was there, I was working on a side project with somebody at Microsoft Research that would help the intelligence community identify individuals through how they post online, give information pertaining to how they might be identified, or what country they're from, male or female, what their profession, what their age. It's interesting how much you can discern from somebody's post if you have enough content. And then the Russia-Georgia war broke out in 2008. I started a open source sort of threat intelligence project called Project Grey Goose. And I invited a bunch of folks that were just wanted to contribute. They came from all over. It was an online exercise. We published the report a few months later, and it also became the basis for my first edition of Inside Cyber Warfare. So that was the Russia-Georgia war in 2008. That was the first time where you had a country invade another country and have both a cyber attack and a kinetic attack happening on day one, of the invasion. That happened again in February of 2022. They had a same strategy. They had a cyber attack accompany their invasion on February 24. I think it was the 24th. So, but short of that similarity, everything else was different. And so I had the good fortune of pure luck, really, making friends back after the first Russia-Georgia war, making friends with a Russian hacker at that time. And he turned out, a few years later, I discovered he actually turned out to be Ukrainian. And so when, shortly before the latest invasion, he reached out and invited me to participate as a writer to document some of the stuff that they were doing on his team. At that point, he had been working for one of the intelligence services in Ukraine as an offensive cyber operator, as a team lead. And so I was able to get an exclusive look behind the scenes at some of their targets, how they attacked them, how they did the research to identify the best way to attack them, and how convert a cyber attack into something with a kinetic effect, meaning the outcome was not to steal information, the outcome was to destroy the building through fire or through causing an explosion, manipulation of the OT system, maybe a combined cyber physical operation where a special operations team would go in and place explosives, and then the cyber team would initiate fires on different floors adjacent to where the explosives were, and that would take down the entire structure. So a lot of that content I was able to put into the book, although there was quite a bit that he couldn't share. But I think that's really one of the things I'm most proud of, because when the war first started, everybody in the cyber field was still referring to a Russia playbook that dated back before 2008, and they didn't have anything current. So I think at least one of the takeaways from this book will be to effectively rewrite that, playbook, because now cyber attacks are so much more dangerous, and it's being integrated, as we spoke before, we started the podcast, it's being integrated with information warfare and the use of social media, and combining the two has found a very effective way to target, individuals. So that's sort of in a nutshell, where I came from and what brought me to the writing of this third edition of the book.
Very interesting. Just kind of to kind of get your thoughts on how things have changed since that first edition, because you said the first one was based on 2008. So how are things evolved since then?
So in 2008, the Russian hackers were simply taking down websites, or they might be stealing information. And there was very little beyond that they were doing online. So now, not to say that didn't cause mayhem, because it did cause a few days of confusion for the state of Georgia, but overall, not very much. You weren't seeing loss of life. You weren't seeing massive damage because of fires or whatever. But shortly after that, and especially, and this is not Russia, as it turns out, this would be with the United States and Israel. And Stuxnet, you have a cyber attack producing a kinetic effect, the destruction of centrifuges. So over the years, at least the hackers that I know in Ukraine have been looking for ways to cause harm, to bring harm to Russian military and strategically valuable sites via cyber means. And so it is not as simple as writing a piece of malware. Not that good malware is simple. I'm not suggesting that. But it is not something that is easily reproducible. In other words, every target has to be is different. And most of the time it requires practice. So these guys will go in and they'll break into the network and they'll start fiddling around with the OT systems to change the settings and see what does this produce, right? What has to be done in order for a fire to be caused in the electrical system, or to cause a gas explosion at Gazprom, which they were able to do multiple times in some of the big gas plants in Russia. One of the biggest in Russia, the single biggest, second biggest in the world. It was a massive explosion that was caused by cyber. And the interesting thing about that is, or one of many interesting things about that, is that they discovered by doing their due diligence beforehand, which is finding out which company makes the SCADA equipment that is controlling the pipelines, and then going to that company and accessing the blueprints or accessing the product specs for that were used at the site, so that they can learn, how to impact the hardware and the software in a way that will cause the most damage. If necessary, if they didn't have the requisite skill, they would find an engineer that did, and then either through bribery or some other means persuade that engineer to explain what they're looking at and what needs to be done. So it's this, the thing that makes this so unique, and the thing that I think we all need to keep in mind, is it's rare that you have such a opportunity to observe a nation that is literally fighting for its life. Everybody in Ukraine understands that if this doesn't come to a if this war doesn't come to an end that gives Ukraine its independence, its guaranteed independence, they're all dead. My friends, the ones that are fighting the war right now, they're already on target lists. Everybody that's been engaged in warfare at a high level, whether it's cyber or espionage or designing strategy and tactics, all are known to Russia and on various targeted lists. Same with their families. So this is a life and death struggle. It's an existential struggle for the Ukrainians. I don't think we can fully appreciate that because, I mean, when was the last time that the United States was facing an existential threat where we were fighting an enemy inside of our own borders, an enemy that was larger and more powerful than we were? I'm not sure. I don't know my history well enough to give you a date, but I know it hasn't been in my lifetime. So that's why I think it's such a opportunity, and we should be, apart from the humanitarian aspect, I think just from a learning aspect, we should be learning as much as possible. And I believe we are learning as much as possible about how the Ukrainians are innovating warfare. And so in my book, it mostly focuses on innovations in the cyber domain, but there's lots and lots of innovations in the battle space when it comes to weapons platforms and drones and artificial intelligence and so on that I didn't write about and I was not privy to. I tried to only write about what I actually could get firsthand information on. So I know at one point I was on a Signal with my friend there, and we were just comparing notes, and I was asking him some questions about some of the material that he had sent over. And then there were several loud noises, so very, very loud bangs, even on, I could hear it was a Signal call. And it turned out that the building that he was in was being bombed at the time. Somebody had seen his van. There were 3 or 4 agency vans in the parking lot. Probably not the best idea, but somebody had noticed them. Somebody was friendly to Russia and took pictures and then posted that online. And within a few hours, they came under attack because of that online photo. It's one of those new ways, right, that information is being transferred, and intelligence services are monitoring that transfer of information in order to help with targeting. The agency that was bombed discovered who did the bombing because they were able to ping the cell phone towers and then get the cell phone number of the guy that posted the information to this, I think it was to Telegram, and then sent out a team to find him. So, which is done using drones and video and other types of surveillance. So it's really if there's a technology that is even in beta, it's being used right now in Ukraine. That to me is just priceless information for the United States, for other allies, to be able to document and use it going forward to increase our own proficiency in a new world and a new type of warfare.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff, and just amazing how it was less likely of a threat until such a major threat nowadays. Cyber warfare wasn't, or just to the general public, we really know much about it, but it's interesting and scary how it's being leveraged now. You think of the damage you could cause, and a lot of cases go unnoticed compared to traditional physical warfare.
Exactly right. The ability to, so we were talking about social media, I think, before the call, and the ability to utilize fake images or tell blatant mistruths or mix some lies in with truth, which is probably the most effective way to do it, is so dangerous. It's so easy to fool a population that doesn't have the patience to actually do the vetting of what they're reading. In fact, studies have shown just recently that a majority of people, I think 60% or more, only read the headline when they see something on social media. They simply read the headline and then assume that the headline has conveyed everything that they need to know about the article, when in fact the headline is probably the least trustworthy part of it, because its only job is to get you to click on it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how many times I've been disappointed by a headline, after reading an article. And so it's so simple now to run an information warfare campaign against a population and use propaganda or use disinformation to achieve an effect, a strategic effect. And there doesn't seem to be a good way to address that. Technology companies don't want to spend the money, and they're not liable in any event. So it's like they have no downside. The upside is clicks. More clicks, more ads. The more ads, the more you can charge. But if the material is wrong, fake, illegal, the platform itself, whether it's Facebook or X or whatever it might be, they can't be sued. So what's the point of acting on it? Unlike a newspaper, which can be sued. And I think the issue with Section 230 U.S. Code that gives technology companies, freedom from a responsibility when it comes to whatever is shared on the platform. And until that law is changed, don't see any solution to the disinformation and misinformation problem that we have.
Yeah, it's just so amazing how people, as we discussed, not really vetting it, not fact checking and sharing it anyway, and just how people just share it, just don't even think twice and share that information. And, people were worried about past elections being fair. That was really the biggest election interference was the misinformation that was being propagated. It wasn't any voting machines being hacked.
Yep. Yeah. You don't even have to worry about facts anymore because nobody really cares. You can put up the fact, right? You can say, this headline is wrong. Here are the actual facts. And people will simply say, says who?
Yeah. Yeah. They're gonna believe whatever they want to believe, or it's some conspiracy theory.
Yeah. It's like somewhere along the line, we've lost an educated population. Like I don't know how that happened or when it happened, but people don't have the curiosity or the desire or the training from when they were young in school to think critically. And if you do try to think critically, or if you do challenge, then what you receive in turn is like a mob mentality, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you say something about a business leader or a political leader that has sort of a cult of personality that's been built around them, and you make some critical remark, and I'm not talking about being rude or insulting or obnoxious. I'm just saying that's not true. Here is what actually happened. An army of supporters, like a cultish kind of, response is what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, even in the cybersecurity field, I remember way back in like 2009, 2010, 2011, that there was lots of argument happening on social media around whether the term APT was a generic term for any threat actor, any type of nation state level threat actor, or if it only was China. And of course, the origin of APT originally was, as I think most anybody that was in the cybersecurity industry back then probably is aware, because there was so much written about this, that it came out of the Air Force, and it was originally supposed to be a designator for the People's Republic of China. But the way that it was being used by Mandiant at the time, it seemed like it would apply to any nation state threat actor, But that was a controversial concept back then. Back then, you would get into an argument online and have multiple attacks directed your way if, God forbid, you were to write that APT could apply to any advanced state-sponsored actor and not just China. So social media is like where you go to get your adrenaline rush, I guess, if there's nothing else going on in your life, we'll get into an argument, or we'll defend our favorite individual company, politician, whatever it might be. And it's still that. I think it's still that way. It's just the areas of argument have just simply changed.
Yeah, back, just on the whole same topic of misinformation, it sure makes it a quick and easy way to distribute that information through social media.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I write about, in my book, I included quite a bit of information about an organization called the Mozart Group. This was an NGO that was set up in Ukraine by a retired Marine colonel. It was a sort of a counter to the Wagner Group, except the Wagner Group is a private military organization, private military company, or PMC. Mozart Group is not. It's an NGO there to provide training to the Ukrainian civilians that were being drafted, and also to do rescue missions to bring civilians out of the front lines where Russia was actively bombing homes and hospitals and so on. And Russia started an information campaign against the founder of the Mozart Group and some of its members, them saying that they were doing organ harvesting. They were going into the battlefield, finding dead Russians, cutting them open, putting their heart and kidneys and lungs and eyes and whatever organs they could into freezers and then, carrying them out. And the entire thing was fabricated. And yet people believed it. And that was done in conjunction with targeting, using planes and tanks and other military forces, targeting the front lines where the Mozart Group was operating. So it was pretty vicious. It impacted their ability to raise money. It impacted their ability to travel in Ukraine and be recognized. If they were recognized, hotels would say, no, we can't have you here, because for a period, if it was known that Mozart Group members were staying in a hotel near the front lines, that hotel would get bombed. So pretty soon, they couldn't get a room anywhere. And of course, Ukraine is a massively big place. It's an 8-hour drive through bombed out roads to get from a safe zone over to the front lines. And so Russia did a pretty good job of making it extremely difficult for them to conduct their mission. There was another, I think I put this in my book, although if it's not, it's on my newsletter, which is InsideCyberWarfare.com. I write about how a year and a half or 2 years into the war, the UN finally arranged a convoy of food and water for civilians still stuck on the front lines, either because they couldn't leave or because they didn't want to leave. But they had no water and no food for weeks and weeks at a time. So the UN stepped in, they organized this convoy, and they got a lot of press about it. But the reality was they stopped 30 miles from the front line. And then they asked the Mozart Group to do the final leg of that, which was too dangerous for the UN to do. By making it life miserable and putting a target on the back of this, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 people that were actually engaged on a day-to-day basis with bringing supplies and evacuating refugees, they effectively cut off a $100 million mission from the UN because it made the last mile of transportation almost impossible. And yet, these guys were still able to pull it off. So it's this combination of social media and kinetic attacks working together. It's very difficult to defend against. And then you add drones, on top of that. So, which is a new technology in warfare. So it's really a completely different battle space. And cyber doesn't really work very well when you isolate it. The best units right now have cyber operators within their special operations team, and they do joint missions. And that's what makes it so effective. One of the things I write about in the book is the destruction of the missile research lab that's I think it's about 70 to 100 miles outside of Moscow, where they designed the Iskander missile and the S-400 missile that was being used very effectively against Ukraine. And they blew up the lab. I think 5 research scientists were killed. Dozens of people were injured. And it was a combination of a 2-man soft team that went in to place the explosives, and then the cyber operators that created electrical fires throughout the building. And then when the fires hit the explosives, of course, you had multiple explosions. There's video of it. And that was in the early days of bringing the war to Russia. So this is, I hope, will be something that the U.S. takes away, because I think it could be equally effective. And I know at least people that I know that have worked cyber in the U.S. for the U.S. government have been asking for something like this for a long time. That they be embedded, with a soft team that's going in for a direct action operation. And they may be, in fact, be doing that now. I don't know. But I do know that they've been doing it for almost the entire war effort since 2022 in Ukraine. And it's proven very effective.
Yeah, that's scary stuff, especially for those that may be enemies of the U.S. learning some of these techniques and stuff to use against us.
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I can understand why there's so much burnout, in the cybersecurity industry as a whole, because you're trying to defend. It's just so taxing to try to defend a network, especially a very large network that is so vulnerable against so many innovative ways to attack. And then you layer artificial intelligence on top of that. Right now, you can utilize AI to help speed up the process of finding soft targets, for example. So it just makes the defender so fatigued that they eventually, I think, move on to other careers. And you have what's already an almost impossible task made so much more difficult when in face of this manpower shortage and the inability to really keep dedicated offensive attackers outside of your network. So now, if you add in there the possibility that the CEO of a company, the company could be breached and the CEO's home could be burned down because of cyber operations, that's the next level of concern, of threat assessment. And how do you mitigate that? There's no good way to mitigate that.
Yeah, some very, very good points there. And then you see some of the companies that have the OT environments and then water treatment plants that are using the same similar technologies to control those, because I forget the exact details, but I think it's somewhere fourth quarter of 2023, I think, that there was a water treatment facility that was affected in Florida, I believe, by some cyber attack.
Right. And the problem that defenders have at whether it's a water treatment plant or an electric generating plant, is that the defensive tools that they have, the companies that build them are private companies, for-profit private companies that run the cybersecurity industry. And they have to be, the principal job is to make money. So the tools have to be scalable, but most of the offensive stuff that's being done in Ukraine, they're custom. They're not using a piece of a 0-day that could then, be defended against. Every single attack is customized. It takes long to do it, but there's no way to, a playbook is not going to catch it. So you're stuck in a real dilemma. And fortunately, because our country, at least right now, does not have an adversary that is trying to literally disable our ability to defend ourselves the way that Russia is doing to Ukraine. We're not really seeing, how vulnerable we could be. But should the situation change, you're going to have power plants with ancient equipment and that are not spending the correct amount of money on their cyber defenses, and the outcome will be ugly for that reason. Just we're not prepared. And so I think, at least in my book, what I try to leave the reader with is the importance of resilience, of building in secondary and tertiary fallback to maintain your supply of whatever service, you're offering that is part of critical infrastructure. So telephone, satellite, electric power, water, sewage, whatever it might be. You have to assume that your first line of production is going down, possibly the second after that. So you need to build in that resilience, because you're not going to keep a dedicated attacker out. You can only hope that you get knocked down, but you can get everything back up and running again within a matter of hours. So I think that's, a takeaway that we could all apply in our home, whether it's our home or our business, how many backups do you have? How resilient are you? What happens if you have no fresh water? What happens if, you know, you don't have the ability to go to a local supermarket because everything is spoiled? And it doesn't take long for food to spoil. And where I live on an island, power goes out probably 3 times a year, and the local Safeway is just they'll stop selling meat and fish and anything that's refrigerated within just a few hours. And that's it. You cannot buy that anymore because the danger of spoilage. So I think now is a good time to educate yourself about these innovations that are happening in Eastern Europe on the battlefield, and then think about what could happen if they were done here, and how prepared am I for survival in the face of something like that. And I don't mean to become a survivalist or a prepper or anything like that. Just common sense. Just apply common sense to your living situation and spend what you can afford to, and be in a community, that feels the same way. I think the last place that I would want to be, and the last place that I would want to be is in a city. My wife and I have moved to a place where you have lots and lots of water, fresh water, salt water, farms, wildlife, so that worst case scenario, you still have the raw essentials you need until things calm down and order is restored.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you bringing up the food supply, because you just think threat actors taking out grocery stores, you taking out the grids, all the things that it affects that sometimes you don't think about. Just like you talk about the food, the meats and stuff going bad or after such a short period of time. So someone wanted to really take out a lot of food sources in a big city, they could do a lot of damage.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, your situation is so much more perilous in a big city. You're in a high rise, maybe power goes out. It's a bad situation. And I think people experienced that during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
It was way worse for somebody who was living in a downtown area during COVID and during lockdowns than for somebody like us that were, living out in the country. Nobody cares if you're going in and out, outside, driving around. You're out in the middle of nowhere, But yeah, I think anybody that weighs the pros and cons will want to move to an area where they're not relying on services that are so vulnerable, in time of war, or to a threat actor that targets their city's critical infrastructure.
Yeah, at least there's someone that did want to move out in the country somewhere outside of the city. At least there's options out there now for, alternative power sources, opposed to being dependent on the grid.
Yeah, there's not a lot of great ones, but at least, you've got some. And even if you don't have power, then you still have water, and you have food, and you have fire. You get, when it comes down to it, if you're really, it may not, you may not care at that point. But depending on how bad the situation is, but at least, you know that you're going to do your very best to provide from what's around you and not be dependent upon services that you have no control over how secure they are. And you're relying on, somebody else's budget and somebody else's perspective of how that money should be spent. I don't want to do that.
So we're getting down towards the end of the episode. Is there anything you'd like to share before we close it out?
I put I put about 8 months of work into the chapter for AI. I think AI is an interesting field, but it's so crazy to read about the risks and associated, or that are perceived to be associated with AI, where it might become sentient, where it might, become like Dave in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or and there are a lot of very, very smart people that believe with all their heart that that's in fact what is going to happen. I'm not one of those people. It literally makes no sense to me that how software is going to become a living thing. But there's hundreds of billions of dollars that have been allocated to AI safety, with the understanding that it is a reasonable assumption to make that AI is going to become sentient and convert humans into their core components to be reused to feed the AI infrastructure. I mean, it's pretty wild stuff. But these are the people who believe it are in important positions in government, in research labs, and they have incredible funding. So the money is, this money should not be spent on imaginary threats. It should be spent on actual threats. And I try to make that point in the chapter. And that's really the whole point of the book, I think, when you get right down to it, is that I try to give facts and first-person accounts across a range of threat landscapes so that the reader doesn't have to be technical. In fact, it's written for a non-technical reader. I try to make it entertaining and convey this information in stories, and so that you can not be swayed by fiction or by fake information or by somebody that's just looking for clicks. Hopefully by the time you're done, you'll be able to assess AI as what is real and what is not when it comes to threats, and the same with other cybersecurity related areas, of concern. The book's available now. It's on Amazon. Shortly, it'll be available on Audible. I think that's in production right now, and people can always reach me by email is probably the easiest way. I don't spend much time on social media, but Jeffrey Caruso at pm.me. It's a Proton mail address. So if you want to contact me with some layer of security, get a Proton account, and our exchanges will be encrypted.
Very good. So we'll be sharing the information on the book as well as your email address. That way, in case someone didn't catch it, but I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to have the chat with me. It's very interesting, hearing more about cyber warfare, actually what's going on out there, as well as your book. Sounds like an awesome resource.
I hope people find it to be true.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Phil, for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Phillip Wylie Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. In the meantime, to learn more about Phillip, go to thehackermaker.com and connect with him on LinkedIn and Twitter at Phillip Wylie. Until next time.